Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will add an animated hamburger icon and mobile menu to our Tailwind CSS project. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. We'll look at our starter code in just a second, but first let's look at what we hope to accomplish today. We're going to add a hamburger menu that is animated and then a menu that shows up that is also animated. So when I click on this hamburger menu, it does a little spin and turns into an X. And then our full screen menu shows up. Of course, this is for a mobile view. And then when I click on the X, it hides the menu. Likewise, if we click on any of our selections or just anywhere in this menu, it will hide the menu also. So we can go to the Contact Us, or we could go to the Testimonials, or really any section of the page, or back to the top. So we've got a couple of different animations. And of course, it's responsive as well. So if we drag the page out to a larger size, our nav bar turns into our selections here and no more hamburger menu. Now, we already did that in the previous lessons. And so if you haven't followed those previous lessons, you could go ahead and go back to those in this series. And there are links to the playlist and everything else in the description below, including that starter source code. So now let's look at the starter code. It's from lesson 3. So today is lesson 4. Let's change the package JSON file to say lesson 4. And we can save that. And there's just a few small changes I want to make before we dive into the menus. So let's go to our index.html page. I'm also going to press Alt-Z to wrap the lines down if they were to extend beyond. So now we can see everything. It just wraps to a second line like you see here on line 14 in case it was extending beyond the page. Okay, after that, let's scroll down to where we have the button, and it is called Mobile Open Button, and it is on line 19 right now. I'm going to change that name, and instead of calling it Mobile Open Button, I'm going to call it Hamburger Button, which makes a little bit more sense because it will have the hamburger icon. And I'll save these as I go. After the hamburger button change, we're also going to change this small hidden. We'll switch this to medium because medium will take it up to the iPad size. And so if we mouse over, if we remember we have our Tailwind IntelliSense extension installed, and if you don't have that, you can search for that in the VS Code extensions, but we did that in a previous tutorial, and you can see at 768 pixels is where this medium media query is identified. So we'll switch that to medium. Likewise, we need to do that with the nav that shows when we do not have a hamburger icon. So we'll switch that to medium as well with an MD here on line 22. A couple of more changes to our hamburger button that we have here. So let me highlight the focus outline none, and we actually want an outline if it has focus. That makes it more accessible. So let's delete that. But let's go ahead and add something too. I want to add cursor-pointer. So it changes to a pointer over the button. And of course, that's instead of that arrow, it looks more like a little hand with a finger when you have a pointer. So we'll save that. And the final change I want to make is in the Tailwind config file. And previously, we defined a couple of custom media queries based on a minimum aspect ratio. And you can see 1/2, well, that would be 50% essentially. I think 65% works better for this tall screen. And so I want to switch this. Of course, you could say 65 out of 100, but you could also say 13 out of 20, and that's the same ratio. So we'll go ahead and save that. And those are the small changes I wanted to make before we start. Okay, back in the index.html, which is where most of the action happens as we apply all of the Tailwind classes inside of the HTML, I want to highlight what we'll be doing and what the difference is. Of course, there's two different things we'll do today. One is a little easier than the other. And so let's go ahead and look at how we'll apply the first one. And that would be to show the menu and have the closing button essentially on the menu screen. In other words, have the menu screen take up the full page. If we go ahead and look at the browser right now, we're looking at the final version here. So when I click the hamburger button, it animates and it shows the menu over the rest of the page, but we can still see the nav bar. The easy way to do this would be to not animate the hamburger button and only animate the menu and have the menu cover up the nav bar as well. And of course, you could have an X to click on the menu itself. So we'll apply that first, And then we'll do a couple of extra things that are a little more complicated to go ahead and animate this hamburger menu in the hamburger icon in the second version. But overall, everything that happens in the first version will need in the second version anyway. So in this first version where we're not animating that hamburger icon, we already have it in place with an HTML entity, and you see that here on line 20. So we don't have to add anything extra there. Let's go ahead though, and below this section that we have that has our title and essentially the full navbar in it, let's go ahead and scroll down to the end of that section and let's add another section. So this section is going to have an ID, and here I use the hashtag to say that it's going to have an ID. I'm using emit and then dash menu, and I press tab, and there we get a section with the mobile menu ID. But we're going to have classes as well. So I could once again use emit for that and chain it all together. So I'll delete that, say section hashtag mobile dash menu, but then I can start adding classes with the dot. So I'm going to say absolute, and then I'm going to have a top dash 0, and that's because it's going to cover the full page. So I want it to start right at the top. Then we'll have a BG dash black, which sets the background to black. Then a W dash full, which is a full width of 100%. Text dash 5XL, so fairly large text. And then we're going to have a flex display, so we'll put flex here, and we'll remove that later. As you'll see, we will toggle that class, but right now we want to go ahead and apply it so we can see what we're doing. So we'll have flex, and then we'll set it to flex column, and then, oh, I need dots, not dashes there. So text 5XL dot flex dash column dot justify dash content dash center, and then we're going to go ahead and leave it at that. I think for now I'll just press tab, and we don't have anything inside of the section yet, so now we need to add a button, and this will be our closing button. So let's go ahead and say button, and we don't need an ID here, so we'll just start with classes. We'll have text dash 8XL, so very large. Then we're going to justify this. Notice we had the flex above where we justified, well, we can't see it right now, but we justified that center. Here we're going to use the self-end class, so that will justify it to the end or to the far right. Then px, which is padding on the x-axis, dash 6. We'll go ahead and press tab, and now we want to use an HTML entity in here as well for the x, and that is the ampersand, the word times, and a semicolon. Okay, I'm going to save that much. And before I add anything further, I think I'd like to see what we're doing as I add these classes. So I'm going to drag this to the left. I will hide the file tree in just a second, but I'm going to drag this over just a bit to the right as well because we're not using up that full window for the browser, so we can see this in mobile view over here on the right. Now I'm going to go ahead and close what we have here. I'll open a new tab, but just to make sure we don't have a conflict with the port number that it launches to. And then I'm going to look at the package JSON again, and we can see our command. We've got a Tailwind command that we need to run so it looks at all the classes that we're adding in our index, and then it creates that style.css file, if you remember that from our previous lessons. So I'll press Control B so we can see just a little bit more here, and then Alt Z so you can see this. Here's the full Tailwind command. I'm going to press Control and the backtick, or you could use the terminal menu to go ahead and launch a new terminal window. And now I'm going to go ahead and type clear just to clear out anything we previously had, and then type npm run Tailwind, and we should start running our Tailwind. That won't launch the site yet, but now it watches our index.html, and of course it adds those classes that it needs to the style.css. So now that we're running Tailwind again, let's go back to our index.html. I could have selected it up here as well, but there it is in the file tree. I'll hide the file tree again, and I'll close the terminal because we don't need it. It will continue to run even though we closed it. And now we can click the Go Live button for our live server extension to launch our HTML over here on the right. So let's see what we get. we now have our HTML launched, but we have this big X that is covering the navbar, but we're not covering the rest yet. So we definitely have some more to add. And just to confirm that we're seeing what we did add, I can highlight this full section here on the HTML document and then comment that out with Control and the slash. There we go. Commented out the full thing and save. And now we once again see our navbar. So you can see we're just adding this section and it had not taken up the full page yet, is why it was only covering up the navbar as it is. So now I'll just Control Z to undo that and save once again, and we see the change. So we are covering part of that. So let's add some more content underneath the button. What we want to do is add another nav element, and then we can add classes here. It's going to have a flex class, flex-column class, then a minimum height, and when we say screen, that sets it to 100 viewport units. So now it will take up the entire page. We'll say items-center, and then we'll also give a padding on the y-axis of 8 between each item. So now let's go ahead and press tab for that, and we have our nav menu. We also want to add one extra attribute to this nav menu, and that is an aria-label. And let's set this equal to mobile, because we have more than one nav element on the page, so it's important to identify each one. Okay, now that we have done that, let's go ahead and add an anchor tag, and it's going to have an href attribute, so it is a link. We can choose that right here. Here we have the link, but this is not going to link to anywhere other than an anchor on the page, and it is the hero. Now we have classes as well, so we could have avoided that or by, of course, using emit there, but we can also just add classes this way, which I'll continue to do. So I've got class with the quotes, and now we'll say a width of full and a space, since we're not using emit, text-center, padding on the y-axis of 6, and then we'll set a hover state and set that opacity to -90. So the link becomes just a little bit see-through when we hover over. Then here we'll say home, because this will link to the top. Now when we save, this covers the full page because we gave it the width, the min h screen, that's 100 viewport units of width, and I can mouse over with the IntelliSense. We will see how that is set. The min height, I said width. There we go, min height 100 VH. And here's our first link. Now we're going to have at least, I'd say, 4 more links. So I'm going to use Shift Alt and the down arrow, and I'll just copy that link 4 times. So now we just need to change the hero anchor to rockets, and then the next one is going to get changed to testimonials, and the next one should be contact, and finally the last one would be footer. Now we just need to change the words. So here we have our rockets, and if we save, we should see these changes. There we go. We've got our rockets. After that, we were going to have testimonials, and then we have contact us. And finally, the footer has the legal information for the company, so we'll say legal. Now we have all of our links, but when we click those links, this won't necessarily go away at this point. We can click home, we can click our rockets, it will link to those spots, but it's not disappearing. We can see that as we mouse over, they flicker a little. That's because of that opacity. So they become just a little see-through, so you can see the action. Notice our pointer is there over each one of these, and we've got a pointer over our close button as well. Now we need to go back to the Tailwind config file. So whether you get there through the file tree or up at the top like I did, either way, go to that Tailwind config file. Now, a more complex topic that we haven't dove too far into is how you can set up a theme in Tailwind. Now, Tailwind has a default theme, and of course you can add your own themes to that as well. You can extend the default theme. What we're doing here is, you see the extend keyword, we are extending the default theme, and we added 2 more media queries to it. Now we're going to go ahead and add keyframes and an animation as well. So after the screens now, I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to type keyframes, And inside of keyframes, I'm going to choose an animation that we haven't created yet, but it's going to be called open-menu. And then after that, curly braces once again, and inside of open menu, I'm going to say at 0%, so the first keyframe. Then I'm going to use transform, and this is going to be a scale Y of 0. This looks more like traditional CSS at this point, just like you would write a keyframe if you were writing CSS. And then I'll put a comma. Now I'm going to do Shift Alt and the down arrow twice, so I don't have to type all of that. But here I'm going to say at 80%, and finally my last frame will be at 100%. Now I'm going to give the menu just a little bounce. So we're going to go beyond 1. We're going to go to like 120% or 1.2. And then finally we're going to end up back at 1. So it stretches just a little further and bounces back up to its resting spot at 1. Okay, I'm going to scroll just a little more and put a comma after these as we are creating these objects inside of this config file. And then I'm going to name the animation here. So I'm going to specify the animation and then name it actually. So now inside of curly braces again, here is the open menu animation that we referenced in the keyframes above. And this is open-menu. Let's give a space and then 0.5 seconds. Then we'll say ease in-out and then forwards. And we'll put a comma after that as well. And save. Now, if this looks strange to you, if you're not familiar with animations, I do have a CSS for Beginners course, and there is an animations chapter in that course. I'll make sure to link to that below as well, and you can reference how these are created. This is traditional CSS right here, so you just need to be familiar with creating an animation and the keyframes for that animation. Now let's go back to the HTML, and we can add those animated classes to our mobile menu. So after our justify content center, let's give a space and we'll start with origin-top. Now this is a transform origin top, so we're telling it where to start the animation. We want it to come down from the top. After that, let's go ahead and add the rest, and that should be animate-open-menu. And that should call the animation that we added. And you can see the keyframes and the animation here when I mouse over with IntelliSense. But there is one more thing to add after that, and that is going to be hidden, because we want to hide this menu until we want to show it later. So we're going to toggle that with just a little bit of JavaScript. But you can see we have a problem right now because we're adding hidden, and we also had a display of flex. So let's remove the display flex. We'll toggle the hidden and we'll remove it, and we'll also add in the flex class, and that will display everything as we see it now. So when I save, this will disappear. So now it is time to add that little bit of JavaScript we need to show our menu. Right now, we're still not getting anything when we click our hamburger icon. So if we go to the file tree, we're going to add another folder inside of the build directory. So I will click new folder. We'll add a JS folder, and then inside of the JS file, I'm going to add a file named main.js. Now I'm going to hide the file tree for just a little more room, and if you're not familiar with JavaScript, this is just vanilla JavaScript or plain old JavaScript in general here. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a function. So I will say const init app, and I'm going to set this equal to an arrow function. And then inside the function, we're going to select our hamburger button. So I'll say const hamburger btn, and I'm using camel case with a capital B there. I'm going to set that equal to document. I'm referring to the HTML document. Then get element by ID, and then I want the ID of hamburger dash button. Now, we can tell that went just a little bit long, so I'm going to have to press Alt-Z again to wrap the line of code down. After that, I also want to get the mobile menu we created. So const mobile menu, that's going to be equal to document.get element by ID as well. And now here I'm going to say mobile-menu, which is the ID we gave to that element. Okay, now that we have selected both of those, I want to go ahead and create a toggle menu function. And this is going to be equal to another arrow function. And inside of this, I'm going to say mobile menu dot class list. So it gets the full list of classes. And this is a DOM token list, as you can see that IntelliSense brought up. So we have the full list of classes. Now I can just say toggle, and I want to toggle that hidden class. Now I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow because I also want to toggle the flex class. And yes, we could also use replace, but then we would have to have two functions. We would have to have one that replaced hidden with flex and one that replaced flex with hidden. Or we'd have to have an if statement inside of the function, which means the function would really be doing kind of two different things. I prefer this, but there is more than one way to do it. Okay, after that, I'm going to use the hamburger button that we've already selected, and I need to add an event listener to that button. And so when that button is clicked, so we're listening for the click event, we're going to call the toggle menu function. But I'm not quite finished because I also want to listen to the mobile menu, so we'll add an event listener there. And if the mobile menu is clicked, essentially anywhere on the mobile menu, so that could be one of the links or it could just be anywhere else, the X that we have for the closing button or just a blank area of the menu, we want to do the same thing and toggle the menu so it is easy to close. So after we add all of that, we've created our init app function. But it won't do anything yet until we call it. So after we've created this init app function here, and you can see it goes on line 1 down to line 12, on line 14, I'm going to say document, which again references the HTML document. I'm going to add an event listener to the full document, and I need to listen for the DOM content loaded event. That tells me the full document, the HTML DOM, has loaded. And then I want to go ahead and call the init app function. You don't want that function to be called before the DOM has loaded, because then these buttons that we're listening for and trying to select, it will cause errors because they won't be available to select yet. So when we save this, we're finished with our JavaScript for our variation number 1. And variation number 2 will only actually have one more line inside of the JavaScript as well. Again, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, this may be a lot for you right now, but I do have a beginner's course on JavaScript where you'll learn all about this stuff and much more. This JavaScript still won't work at this point though. We need to link it to our HTML. So we'll go back to the HTML file, scroll to the top, and underneath our link to the CSS, we want to add a script tag, and you can choose the one that has source because we need to specify the source. We're going to say look in our JS folder and then choose the main JS file. I also want to put one attribute here, and it is defer, which again is telling this script do not load the JavaScript until you've loaded the rest of the page. So we're just being extra cautious there to know our JavaScript will work after the page is loaded. At this point, our JavaScript should work, but there's one more thing we should really do, and we're going to need it in the second variation anyway. But anytime you're working with JavaScript and Tailwind CSS, you should do what I'm about to do, and that is go back to the config file. Now I'll hide that file tree so we can see just a little bit better. Remember our content up here. We did this in the very first lesson of the series. We told Tailwind to look at our HTML files inside of the build folder, look at all the classes we're using, and then generate the CSS. But what if there's a class that we reference in our JavaScript that isn't applied in the HTML at all until we need it, and then JavaScript applies it? So what we should do is also tell Tailwind to look at our JavaScript files. So we can put a comma here, and now we can specify where Tailwind should look for our JavaScript. So we'll say in the ./build/JS/ and then an asterisk once again, .js. So it should look inside of this JS folder for all of our JS files, any that we add in there. And if we mention any classes in these JavaScript files that are not mentioned in HTML, it will still include them in the style.css when it builds that. And that's important, especially if there is a class that is not applied in the HTML at the beginning, but will be applied later with JavaScript. And that's exactly what's going to happen in our second variation. So I thought it was important to just go ahead and do that now. Okay, now that we have completed all of that, our hamburger icon and animation should work for the menu. So let's click our hamburger icon. And now our menu shows up and it gives that little bounce we talked about. Now we can click on one of the links like our rockets and we go to that section because the anchors are working, contact us. We can also click the X to just close the menu. But we could also click just a blank area of the screen, like down here in the bottom, just to close the menu as well, and it won't go anywhere different than where it was. So if we're at the home area here and we click at the bottom, we're still at the home. So it's important to just be able to do that to easily close the menu. And you can get too carried away with too many animations, especially when you want to make a page work quickly. So we didn't want anything big to happen. We just want a nice quick little animation that doesn't really get too annoying or too in the way if you have to use the page over and over again. So variation 1 is complete. And if you're happy with that, you can use that in your project, and that's fine. We're going to move on to variation 2, where we also animate the hamburger icon and the menu comes down below the navbar so we can still see the navbar as well. Let's go back to the index.html file. And now we're not going to use HTML entities anymore. So I'm going to highlight this and comment it out with Control and the slash key. There it is. And I will not remove it from the code just in case you want to reference this first version that we already completed. Likewise, not just the HTML entity here, but we're not going to use this button at all, this close button that currently shows up, because we're going to animate that hamburger icon and turn it into our close button in the second variation. So once again, I'm going to do Control and the slash to just comment that out. I'm going to save those changes now and we can see our hamburger icon has disappeared. Let's scroll back up to our hamburger button, and I want to add a few more classes to the button before we start actually building the icon. The first one is relative, because we're going to position some things absolutely inside of the button very soon. So I'll start out with a relative parent on the button itself. After that, I'm going to say W-8 for width and H-8 for a height. And so now if we mouse over, you can see the size. That's about 32 pixels. And we just made a square for the button. And relative is a position relative. One other important change I almost forgot is to scroll down to our mobile menu section again, and instead of top 0, we want top -68. So it shows up just underneath our nav bar when the menu does show up. And if you remember from our previous lessons, once again, when we defined, well, let's go ahead and look at, I believe it's the input that we have for our Tailwind build. So let me find that here. Inside the source directory, then input.css, where we can write our own classes, we had a min height, and we set each section for this particular class to 100 viewport units minus 68 pixels, because we'd already determined, due to padding and line height, that is what we have for a height of our navbar is 68 pixels. I'll hide the file tree once again, and we are ready to start building our hamburger icon. We're going to start with a div, and we'll give it a background white, and then we'll say W-8 and H-1. Let's also make it rounded, and we'll position this absolute. If I press tab and save, now we have a line over here, which would essentially be the middle line of our hamburger menu. I'm going to put a couple of other classes that won't seem like they're doing much, but the top -4, let me mouse over this, and you can see it's 1 rem or 16 pixels. If I save, it doesn't change hardly anything there at all because it's already basically centered. But then I want to have a minus margin top -0.5. Again, not much of a change. You see it shift up just a little bit, and that's what I'm doing with these two classes. Is I'm essentially centering it with a position absolute, and that is giving it 16, and then essentially, let's see here, removing 2 pixels, I believe. So that just moves it up a little bit better for me. If we were to go ahead and select this and look at how it rests in the button, you could see the difference. But I'll let you do that on your own if you want to. But that's just me being picky also. Okay, after those classes are applied, we need to go ahead and add the top and the bottom part of the hamburger icon as well. And we're going to do that with pseudo elements. So we'll have before and then a colon. Then we can say content dash. Now we have brackets and have an empty string here. Let's have the other bracket as well. That's not what we need. Single quote, other bracket, and now we should close this out with the double quote, I believe is how it was started for the class. Yes, so we have some content here that is just an empty string essentially for the content. But then we can go ahead and add more to this. So we'll say before, and we'll have a bg-white. We have to put before each one of these. Then we have to set the width and the height the same. So before and h-1. And then finally before rounded, before absolute, before. Okay, now we're not going to add the rest of the before yet. Let's stop right there and save. And so far, we just see an extra line added there, so we haven't changed anything. Now, let's go ahead and add the rest of the before. So we'll go ahead and say before transition dash all before duration dash 500, and then before minus translate dash x dash 4. So that's on the x-axis that it's being translated. Before minus translate dash y dash 3. Now, oh, I didn't get a y there, I got a 6, y dash 3. Now let's save that, and you can see it puts it up above. So if you're wondering what each one does, let's go ahead and remove some of these. And I actually didn't need to put in the transition all and duration yet, because that's more for an animation that will happen as something moves. Let's save this and we still see the same thing. So I've just removed the transition all and duration for now. So let's go ahead and remove the X and see what happens. And save. Now you can see it shifted over, because normally when it starts to create here, it would start right in the middle. And so there it started in the middle and it goes the full width over to the right. So if we go ahead and use that minus value for the translate, it moves it back where we think it should begin. Likewise, if we don't have the Y on the Y-axis, moves it up and down, it would look like there's just one line again. They're on top of each other. So we need the Y in there also. So once we save, we have both. And we can, of course, line these back up just a little bit better. So why don't we copy everything we have that starts with before, so we don't have to type that all again. And space 1. Go ahead and return down to the next line. No, we don't need that. Whatever that was. There we're on the next line. Now I'll paste all of this in, and I'll select all of the before. So I select the first one and then Control D, get all of these, and type after. Now save, and we still don't have 3 lines, and that's because our translate X and Y need to be just a little bit different. The translate X actually stays the same, but the translate Y needs to be positive. So when we save, now we have a 3rd line. If not, they were just on top of each other once again. Again, if I remove the translate X and save, you see it shifts to the right. So we don't want that. I'll Control Z to put it back. And now the 2 properties I mentioned before that we didn't need to display our hamburger icon, but we will need when it is animated, and that is transition dash all. And then we're going to override the duration. You can see here transition all actually will set a duration of 150 milliseconds. We want it to be a little bit longer than that. So let's go ahead and set a duration dash 500. And then when we mouse over that, you can see it is a transition duration of 500 milliseconds. Now let's select both of these, and then I'm going to paste at the end of the before content, and we need to add a before here. So I'll just copy the before colon, apply it to the transition all and to the duration. And now I'm going to copy both of those and move down here to the end of the after as well. Paste those and change these befores to afters here and save. So now we're ready for the animation. Now before we create the animation class, I want to reference the Tailwind docs quickly. And let's go ahead and look up arbitrary values. Here it is, using arbitrary values. And if we look at this example, you can see anything you put inside the brackets can be specific CSS essentially. So if you want a specific value for top instead of the predefined Tailwind values, you could do that with an arbitrary value inside of brackets. And you can do that with other things too. We see that with a background color here in their example. So brackets, and then they are specifying the exact hex code for that color. And we see several other examples here as well. Grid columns, fit content, and it's referencing different things. So you've got several examples of that, and I'm going to use an arbitrary value as we define this animation. So I wanted to highlight that, and you may not have realized it, but with our before and after content, we were already using arbitrary values here for those empty strings as well. So now when I define this animation, I also want to reference the @apply because it says reusing styles with @apply or extracting classes. So I just want to apply one class with JavaScript, not many classes as might be needed with Tailwind. And so the way we can do that, and it gives an example here, here's before extracting a custom class. You can see this button that they show in the example has many different classes applied to it. But after it's extracted, all they need to apply is button primary. And that is very handy when you're using JavaScript. However, they do emphasize, and here they show how apply works that I'll be using in a second as they define this button primary class. But they emphasize not doing this with apply just to make things look cleaner in Tailwind. And they give several reasons for that. So I want to highlight that. Of course, you have to think of the class names. You have to jump between multiple files. It says changing styles is scarier, and that's because, of course, your other teammates or whoever else is working on it may not understand that you aren't using the Tailwind names, and they won't be familiar with the names that you've made up. And finally, they of course emphasize your CSS bundle overall, your file size will be bigger. So all of those are good reasons not to suddenly start just using apply everywhere and basically writing CSS once again. Continue to work with these Tailwind classes whenever possible. But a great use of apply is creating one class that can be applied with JavaScript instead of applying all of these different classes with JavaScript. So that's what we're now going to do. And I'm going to do that back in the file tree. Go to this input CSS file that we have in the source directory, and this is where we want to do this. Now we've got Tailwind base components and utilities. Animations should also be under utilities. Really, the base components and utilities is all about how Tailwind organizes their classes. So yes, if you put it under components or base, it would also work, but really for organization, animations and classes related to the animations belong under utilities. So that's where we're going to go. I'll hide that file tree once again, and let's start creating our class. And the class is going to be named toggle-button, and I'll abbreviate button. Now inside of this class, we'll start with this @apply, and now this will let us use Tailwind classes inside of this custom class we are creating. And now I'm going to use an arbitrary value, and that's because I want to make a child selector. So I'm going to apply this class to the button, but I'm going to select the div and that pseudo element before and pseudo element after inside of the button. To do that, I need to create a child selector here. I'm going to start with the ampersand and then say div. And if we were to create a child selector in CSS, it would have, say, the button over here and then the greater sign and div. So the ampersand is just representing the parent or whatever toggle button is applied to. So once we have that, then I'm going to say 2 colons and before, because this is how we would select a pseudo element before, then another colon, and now translate -y -0. After that, I need to go ahead and copy this so I don't have to continue typing that. and paste that once again. And now I'm going to have rotate dash 45 for 45 degrees. I'm going to do a space, but also Alt Z, so this wraps down to the next line. And now I'm going to copy those lines, or both of those classes that we just added, or styles, I should say, as we're creating this new class. And I want to just change the befores to afters again. The translate-y-0 is still accurate for both. However, the after needs to be a minus 45 degrees. And in Tailwind, we put the minus in front of the rotate. And now let's just select the div itself instead of the before-after pseudo element. So this would actually be the middle line in the hamburger icon. And here we're going to set it to transparent. And then once again, I need to select that div. Oh, I need a bracket. There we go. And greater than div. There we go. And then this is going to once again be a rotate dash. And now I'll put another arbitrary value, 720 degrees. Now I think I'm going to remove this at first, and we can look at the animation without that. So we'll put in the rotate afterwards. This is also a good point to highlight a problem I had earlier when I was preparing the tutorial, and that is when I was saving in VS Code. I have auto format on save. It kept adding a space between these. So if you are having that problem as you save your file, go into your file, and then I believe we want preferences eventually, wherever I'm at here. I'm having a hard time with the file menu. Let's find preferences, there it is. And then we want to look at our settings. And inside the settings, search for CSS format. See what comes up here. And we have CSS format enable. I disabled that because I was having that problem. So just for this tutorial, I usually have that enabled. I went ahead and disabled. So if you are having a problem where saving is getting auto formatted and adding a space like that, you don't want that, go ahead and make that change as well. Now I'm going to close that settings above, and of course you could do that either way, but then go to the JavaScript file from the file tree or just from clicking above like I did. And we have one more line of JavaScript to add here, and it's going to be inside of the toggle menu function. So now I'm on line 8. I'm going to have hamburger button, and then dot class list dot toggle, and I'm going to toggle the class that we just created, toggle dash button. Now let's go back to our Acme Rockets, and we have our hamburger menu here. It's ready to click. When I click, notice we've got the X now. So we started here, and what happened, we go back, we click again, and it closes because it's toggling those classes. The middle one becomes transparent. We set that in our class here. Here is the transparent. So the middle one, the div itself, becomes transparent. The before translates Y back to 0. Remember, we previously translated those up 3 and down 3 so they wouldn't be layered on top. So they now translate back to 0, but then also they rotate, and one rotates plus 45, the other minus 45, and so that makes them cross, and we get that animation there. It's a nice little animation, and it's a very standard animation. We can make it just a little more attractive by putting in the full rotation of the button, so I'll put a space after our transparent. I'll select the div one more time, and I'm going to say rotate dash. Now put our bracket for an arbitrary value because we want to specify 720 degrees and save. And so now when I click, the button rotates a few times. It just looks a little cooler that way, doesn't it? So maybe you like it, maybe you don't. You don't have to add the rotation, but it's a nice little change as well. Okay, we've completed the mobile menus and we're almost finished with the project, but a couple of things I want to highlight now, things that I didn't necessarily go too far in depth with, and you want to look at the customization part of the Tailwind CSS docs. It talks about themes here. We've done some of that. We extended themes. Colors, you could also look into custom variables. There's things I definitely want to cover in a future project on my channel, and I hope to do that. The other thing that I want to do, of course, is drag this back now, and we'll see how the page changes. But if we look back at our package JSON In a previous lesson, we installed the dev dependency of Prettier for Tailwind here, and I'll drag this over so now we can see this in the full screen. This Prettier plugin, and that is because I had talked about the order of the classes. Now, as we applied those and we're building this project, we just put them in however I felt about doing that, and that's fine when you do it as well. However, if you're working on a team, it's going to be really awkward and difficult if everybody's putting the classes in different orders. Well, just for this solution, Tailwind has created this Prettier plugin, and of course you need to have Prettier installed. And so we did, of course, we're using npx for Prettier, so it just executes it. We don't really have to have Prettier installed for that, but you do have to have the plugin installed, I should say. So Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS. If you don't have that, I can once again quickly show you. You could just type, let's get a separate terminal going. Here we go. You could just type npm I, and then you would want to have that plugin, and then you want to have -D, so it saves it as a dev dependency. After you do that, then we put in the Prettier script up here. So it will just run this script, and it's looking at all of our HTML files inside of the build directory, which we only have the one. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's look at the index first. So let's see the order some of these are in, especially I know for a fact it prefers to put the media queries like this medium size hidden right here. We'll put that at the very end of this class list for the hamburger button, for example. So let's go ahead now and run that package.json script that we see here, which was npm run Prettier. This should also flag any errors we have, and that's a good thing too. And we may have an error, so let's find out. Go ahead and pull this up. Let's look. It looks like everything finished out okay. So if there are no errors, let's go back and look at our index.html. Things have changed. Notice it has organized our elements just a little bit. And notice our medium media query, or the hidden, is here at the end. As far as that goes, it's changed the order of some of these other things we added to these other classes. So any media query is basically at the end of the list now, and it's put all of the classes in the recommended order by Tailwind. So you want to go ahead and run that before you push your code to GitHub, before you would, of course, go ahead and deploy your project, which I want to do in the next tutorial. So that's coming up as well. And most importantly, you would want to run this Prettier extension if you were working on a team, because then all of the classes would be ordered in the same way for each team member as the code was pushed to the shared repository. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.